Welcome to another episode of Diplomatic Discord. I'm your host Khalil Al-Wazir, and for those who are just tuning in, this channel is dedicated to bridging the differences between the world of academia and the world of diplomacy, and in doing so, we aim to communicate the findings of literature reviews on mediation, on peace building, on post-conflict reconciliation, and communicating these findings towards a broader audience of interested observers as well as practitioners and diplomats alike. Now, usually this would be the case. And the way I started this channel is, in essence, to communicate the findings of my research and to translate these literature reviews as I go about my research. But if you're a committed listener, you will have noticed that it's been a little over a month since I published my last episode. And the reason is, well, this conflict that has just occurred in Gaza has been deeply troubling to me. Many of my family is currently in Gaza, much of my extended family. So it's confused my thinking, and it's made it more difficult to focus on my research in the day-to-day affairs. I've been glued to the screens, reading the news, consuming every article and report on the matter, and it's made it difficult to continue my research. So instead of not posting a video, I thought might as well bring these insights from my readings and my analyses of this conflict to you. This way, you not only get an insight into the perspective of a PhD student in political science, but also that of a Palestinian. So, to begin, it's important to state what this war is not. The war started on October 7th, yes, but it's not a war anymore. This is now an ethnic cleansing campaign, a genocide. And Israel is currently using October 7 as an excuse for its ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip. And I'm not the first person to say this either. Although every Palestinian knew this immediately. Every Arab, from Egypt to Jordan to the whole of the Arab League, called out that this was Israel's pretext and excuse for a mass population transfer. And in this episode, I will discuss with you the evidence that points that Israel is moving in this direction. But to start, who else called this a genocide? Very recently, the director of the United Nations Human Rights Office in New York resigned because of the United Nations' inability to prevent this genocide that's happening on Gaza. And in his resignation letter to the High Commissioner, he stated that this was a textbook case study of genocide, from the pretext to the operations, as well as the rhetoric, statements of intent coming out of Israeli generals, Israeli ministers, as well as the Prime Minister himself. So to understand the gravity of this accusation, that what Israel is currently doing in Gaza is a genocide, it's important to define this term. And it's also important to define the term ethnic cleansing as well. So ethnic cleansing refers to the systematic, forced removal of ethnic or religious groups from a given territory with the intent of creating a region inhabited by a people of a singular ethnicity. And genocide is defined as the intentional action to destroy a people, usually defined as an ethnic, national, racial, or religious group, in whole or in part. So it is the intention to destroy a particular group in whole or in part. Now, the former, that of ethnic cleansing, is not a crime, an independent crime under international law, but genocide is a crime under international law, and it's binding not only on all of the states who have signed the Convention Against Genocide, but on all states, even those who haven't signed it, because of the remit of international law. And the crime of genocide is considered the gravest crime against humanity. No crime is higher in its egregiousness than this one. And the two, by the way, go together. Usually, genocide is the means towards the end of ethnic cleansing. the replacement of one group by another. And this is what Israel is trying to do. And the reason why I say this is because there are a number of actions it's carrying out which can fall under the definition of genocide. Now, according to the criteria set out by the United Nations in this definition of genocide, there are a number of actions. I'll only list the ones that Israel is currently accused of doing. First is the killing of members of the group, in this case, the Palestinians. Second is causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. And third is deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. These are the three things Israel is currently doing to the Palestinians in Gaza. This is a genocide. So let's start with each of them one by one. In terms of killing members of the group and causing serious bodily harm, Israel's disproportionate use of force has already claimed the lives of 9,000 Palestinians, 70% of them women and children. 9,000 Palestinians in 25 days. To put it in perspective, that is more civilians killed, or as many civilians killed, as in the 565 days of war by Russia on Ukraine. And in these 25 days, Israel has killed over 3,700 children. While Russia, in its prolonged conflict with Ukraine, in the course of 565 days, managed to kill 550 children. The Israelis have killed 3,700 children. 3,700 children. This is not a war. This is a genocide. And of course, Israel uses the excuse that it has a right to defend itself, and that Hamas is using the population of Gaza as human shields through its tunnel networks and otherwise. Now, even were this to be true, which it is not, but even were it to be true, this would not fly in an international court. This would be no license to kill the hostages. If a maniac or a lunatic were to kidnap a few hostages in a hospital, the police force is not allowed to go and bomb the hospital. But this is exactly what the Israelis are doing. This is, again, a genocide. Now, in terms of mental harm, this war marks the fifth such war in the 16-year-long blockade on Gaza. And the war and siege have not only devastated Gaza's infrastructure, have not only made it impossible for Gazans to have a stable livelihood, with 70% of the population unemployed. It's not only destroyed all of the country's, the states, the cities' capital stock, but it also promoted a state of constant despair, of fear, of panic, leading to widespread mental health issues. And the recent communications blackout during the initiation of its ground invasion marks the latest such example of the psychological war the Israelis are waging on Gaza. Families were unable to ascertain the state of their family's safety because of the communications blackout. Paramedic teams could not communicate or coordinate the rescue efforts effectively because of that communications blackout. And there is no justification for it militarily. Of course, they say that this is because they wanted to block Hamas's communications, but in reality, Hamas doesn't use such communications to begin with, ones that could be intercepted by regular cell phone lines. They know they would be listening in. The real intent behind it is psychological warfare against the population. The real intent behind it is to make it harder for journalists and citizens in Gaza to stream the atrocities, the crimes against humanity Israel commits in this ground invasion. Because the Israelis know that as soon as their soldiers went in, that the brutality will be completely predictable in its consequences in its human cost. So this is not a war, this is a genocide. Now, to put it in perspective of how much mental harm this has caused, in the past 16 years of siege on Gaza, any child born in the past 16 years has known no life. They were born dead. They have been raised in a state of constant siege, war, hopeless poverty, and trauma. None of them will come out of this without some scars, mental or bodily scars. And 50% of Gaza's population are children. So to put that in perspective, 50% of all of Gaza has known nothing but siege, poverty, despair, and hopelessness. This is not a war, this is a genocide. And in terms of inflicting conditions on Palestinians, calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, not only is the siege a part of it, but they have consistently sought to degrade Gaza's ability to sustain its inhabitants. Israel has consistently, in every war, targeted electricity generation and distribution systems, targeted medical facilities, targeted water sources. This is a strategy designed to make the long-term inhabitability of the region impossible. This is a genocide. Now, usually what people say when making the claim of genocide is the hardest part about determining whether an action is or is not genocidal is determining intent. And what is meant here is what are the justifications for Israel's targeting of civilians, indiscriminate targeting of civilians, for Israel's capital punishments, for Israel's collective punishment of the Palestinian population. Well, the intent can be found in the words of the Israeli ministers, in the words of the Prime Minister, in the words of retired generals. And to start, Yoav Gallant, the Minister of Defense of Israel, as soon as the war started, he said, and I quote, "I have ordered a complete siege on the Gaza Strip. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel. Everything is closed. We are fighting human animals, and we are acting accordingly." Now, this declaration of intent targets the civilian population of Gaza. This is as clear a statement of intent as could be. He is not saying that Hamas is human animals. He is saying here that he is imposing a siege, a blockade on food, water, fuel, medicine, all supplies on the whole of Gaza. This is genocidal. Now, Israel's Minister of Heritage also recently stated that, and I say this within quotations, northern Gaza is more beautiful than ever. Blowing up and flattening everything is amazing. Once we are finished, we will hand over the lands of Gaza to the fighting soldiers and settlers who lived in Gush Katif. Now, that's as clear a call of ethnic cleansing. Destroy all of Gaza so that Israelis can come and move in. This is not a war, this is a genocide. Or take the former head of National Security Council, Giora Aylan, now a retired Major General working in a think tank. He said, between quotations again, Israel needs to create a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Gaza will become a place where no human being can exist. Or to take Netanyahu's recent speech that draws parallels between Gazans and the biblical Amaleks. And in the biblical story, you should know that the Israelites were instructed to go and smite the Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox, sheep, camel, and ass. That's from the biblical story. So, this dehumanizing rhetoric This is the type of rhetoric that always precedes genocides and ethnic cleansings. This is the type of rhetoric that serves as the canary in the coal mine. It's the warning for all to hear and understand and act to prevent. From the Mills Colleen's continuous references to Tutsis as cockroaches in Rwanda before the Rwandan genocide, to the current statements coming out of Israeli soldiers, from Yoav Gallant to Netanyahu, to retired generals calling Palestinians as human animals. Genocides and ethnic cleansings are entirely predictable and preventable. And this rhetoric is the clearest siren call for all to hear that this is not a war, this is a genocide. Now, this is all sufficient to prove intent, but the real measure of intent lies in the war plans of what the Israelis are planning in Gaza. And very recently, and I mean extremely recently, there was a leaked policy paper from the Israeli Ministry of Intelligence dated on October 13th, which outlined some of the options the Israelis could take, that the ones that they were considering from after they finished their operations in Gaza, on what they would do with the civilian inhabitants of Gaza. Now, in this report, they outlined 3 options. 2 of the options the report openly rejected, and 1 option it fully endorsed. Option A was to reinstate the Palestinian Authority in the Gaza Strip after Israel destroys Hamas. But the report rejected this option because it considered this option a victory for the Palestinian national movement. Option B is to create another local administration other than Hamas in the Gaza Strip after the Israelis destroy it. But it also rejected this possible solution because it could lead to a future Palestinian state. Option C, and this is the one I again stress is the one that the report endorses. Option C outlines the complete ethnic cleansing of all of Gaza, all 2.3 million inhabitants, pushing them into the Sinai of Egypt, putting them in permanent cities, tent cities that would then become permanent cities, and creating a buffer zone between these cities in the Sinai and the other new the Israeli border. This is the plan that they endorsed. Now, of course, Egypt immediately sensed, as soon as the Israelis sent a directive for the 1.1 million Palestinian residents of northern Gaza to evacuate, that the Israelis were planning such a strategy, such an outcome. And they immediately rejected the option of forced mass transfer of Palestinians into the Sinai. So, this idea of forced transfer is an ethnic cleansing. They have it in their Ministry of National Intelligence in one of their policy papers, and it was leaked for a reason. It was leaked for a reason. Because this is what they're planning. This is not a war. This is a genocide. Now, when you look at this paper, you see the degree of hubris and arrogance of the Israelis. In this paper, they not only said, let's just completely ethnically cleanse the whole of Gaza, push them into the Sinai, and Egypt will accept it. They expected the Egyptians, the Saudis, the Emiratis to pay for it in this report, to nationalize the Palestinians. The arrogance. Now, of course, the Egyptians completely rejected it, but the Israelis have a history of creating fait accomplis. They have a history of creating facts on the ground, of violating international law with impunity. And I would not be surprised if they create another one here. If they force Egypt's hands by making it so that no Palestinian can live, by perhaps even threatening the full massacre of all of Gaza, unless the Egyptians open the border. This is the state we're dealing with. This is not a war. This is a genocide. So, since the release of this policy paper, since the leak of this document, of course the Prime Minister downplayed it as a concept paper, not as something they were seriously considering. But his other statements say otherwise. He has already referred to this as akin to Israel's War of Independence. Now, for those who don't know, in 1948, Israel's so-called War of Independence is also known as the Palestinian Nakba, our catastrophe. And it was a catastrophe precisely because the Israelis commit a mass ethnic cleansing campaign of all of historic Palestine, expelling 60% of the population of historic Palestine, 800,000 Palestinians at the time, that later became the largest refugee population in the world. To this day, Palestinians are the largest refugee population in the world. And the inhabitants of Gaza, Gazans are second, third, fourth generation descendants of those refugees from 1948. And what the Israelis are doing today is an ethnic cleansing, not only on Gazans, but those descendants of the formerly ethnically cleansed Palestinians of 1948. How unjust could a state of affairs be? How many times do we have to be ethnically cleansed for the world to say enough is enough? This is not a war, this is a genocide. So he compared it to the War of Independence. And they say, the Israelis, this is a part of their historical narrative, they say that in the War of Independence, the Arab armies attacked because they rejected the peace plan that the United Nations partition plan offered, and the Israelis accepted. But in reality, what they don't tell you from that history is that their ethnic cleansing campaigns began before the partition plan was announced, before Israel even accepted the partition plan, and that the Arab armies attacked after. And even if the Palestinians rejected the partition plan, the plan itself was unjust, which entailed the mass transfer of Palestinians, which entailed giving the majority of the land to the minority immigrant population. It was unacceptable then. And the Israelis have lied about their history and their narrative. The Nakba preceded that declaration. But that's a tangent. So, in another way in which he said this was like the war of 1948, Netanyahu openly stated at the start of this war that this will change the map of the Middle East. And the map that he's talking about, is the map he showed to the General Assembly in September. And in that map, he showed the territory of Israel encompassing the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. A full annexation of both. That's what he meant by it will change the map of the Middle East. And one has to ask, what will happen to the Palestinians in this case? Again, this is not a war, this is a genocide. So, in this context, it's important to note that the Israeli policy has never changed. From 1948 to today, it has never changed. It's been a policy of a simple equation. The equation is maximum land, minimum Palestinians. It's a policy of settler colonialism. And in doing so, the Israelis have constantly expanded settlements. They have constantly violated international law. They have continued to try to change the demographic nature of the ancient city of Jerusalem. And very recently, they have been pushing for policies that make it so that any Palestinian who is arrested in Israeli courts, that Palestinians could be given the capital punishment, the death penalty. That was what the whole judicial reform bill in Israel was all about. They've been trying to push the policy of annexing the West Bank. They've been trying to push the policy of making it so that any Palestinian who's Palestinian citizen of Israel who's suspected of disloyalty, that they could be expelled from the State of Israel and renounced of their citizenship. All of these policies have been pushed by the far-right government of Israel, currently the most extreme far-right government of Israel. And these are the governments from Likud to Ben-Gvir's Jewish Power Party to Smotrich's Zionist Party. All of these far-right fanatic governments have had one goal in mind. And that goal is a full Israeli state from the river to the sea. Now, the idea of an Israeli Jewish state from the river to the sea, if it is to be democratic, is incompatible with the idea of a Jewish state. The only way in which it can be so is if they ethnically cleanse all of the Palestinians, because the population of Israel and Palestine together has about parity. 8 million Palestinians, 8 million Israelis. If they annex the West Bank and now the Gaza Strip, and they become a democratic state, to remain a democratic state, either they would have to impose an apartheid state where Palestinians have no rights, or they would have to ethnically cleanse the whole of Palestine so that they can maintain the Jewish nature of the demographic structure of the state. So they've been openly moving in the direction of an ethnic cleansing for quite some time now. And by the way, the idea of a two-state solution, the Israelis were only willing to accept because a part of the Israeli public came to the conclusion that you can't get rid of the Palestinian population. Therefore, let them have their own state so that we can maintain, by we, I'm referring to them as the Israelis. The Israelis can maintain their Jewish state, the democratic Jewish state. Now, the Israeli far right has been moving in the direction of making a two-state solution impossible, creating facts on the ground, expanding settlements. And in the past 20 years, they've expanded settlements from 150,000 to well over 700,000 settlers in the West Bank, making a Palestinian state, a contiguous Palestinian state, more and more of an impossibility. And they did this intentionally. They've been trying to move in the direction of annexing the West Bank. And the Judicial Reform Bill was all about this. They knew the Supreme Court would come in the face of it, so they wanted to overhaul the judiciary. Netanyahu had more selfish motives, and he also wanted to push this policy as well. Netanyahu has committed his whole political career on making a Palestinian state impossible. So this is the context of what happened on October 7th. And this is the context of the state we are dealing with. The Israeli state is a military occupier, a settler colonial state, and its equation, its basic fundamental policy is maximum land, minimum Palestinians. So it is in this context that this war on Gaza is happening. And again, I cannot stress this enough. This isn't a war. This is a genocide. So, assume the Israelis succeed in this. They do ethnically cleanse all of the Gaza Strip, push them to the Sinai. What happens then? Would it end the conflict? Would it end the cycle of violence? You'd have to be naive or historically ignorant to believe that. Because the whole conflict between us Palestinians and the Israelis has started precisely because of the events of 1948, the ethnic cleansings of 1948. Every single refugee became a revolutionary. In the camps in Jordan, in the camps in Lebanon, the PLO was formed out of a leadership. Again, the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. Every single one of their leaders has experienced the trauma of the ethnic cleansings of 1948. And because of that trauma, they decided to pick up arms and fight for their freedom, fight for their dignity, fight for their liberation. This is the core of the national movement. And if they do so again, if the Israelis commit another ethnic cleansing in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, well, history will repeat itself. because the Palestinian national consciousness is resolute in its determination to make a stand and to fight for freedom and to fulfill our right to self-determination. And no matter what Israel does, it will never succeed in trying to destroy the Palestinian national identity. So, this war, this genocidal ethnic cleansing that they're planning, will be doomed to fail. It will never bring Israel security. It will never bring the region security. It will only perpetuate instability, and it will only continue to make the Middle East a volatile region. So, this is the reality of this war. As we speak, the Israelis have already launched as many operations on the northern Gaza Strip and as many airstrikes to displace 1.4 million Palestinians. They've leveled well over 50% of all structures in the northern Gaza Strip. They've flattened Gaza, the city of Gaza. Now, they've made the 1.4 million Palestinians homeless, killed 9,000, mostly civilians, 60% women and children, 3,700 children. And this is only the beginning of the war. Again, this is not a war, this is a massacre, this is a genocide, this is an ethnic cleansing campaign. But Israel will always state that what it's doing is out of military necessity. But we all know now that there is an ulterior motive at play. An ulterior motive. That of making the Gaza Strip uninhabitable for Palestinians. And the forced mass transfer of Palestinians from Gaza to the Sinai. And if the Egyptians stand their ground, if they refuse the Israeli ultimatum, then the Israelis will still continue with their ethnic cleansing campaign. They'll just kill more Gazans, more Palestinians, and they will push them into a more compact corner of the Gaza Strip. This is not a war, this is a genocide. So, based on all of this, we know that the Israelis have the intent. And as a result of this, the international community must act now to vociferously voice their condemnation and outline their red line. The international community must follow the lead of Arab states in what they have already proclaimed as a complete and total rejection of any plan for mass transfers. And the Arabs have said this on October 12th, as soon as the Israelis ordered the 1.1 million residents of northern Gaza to leave the north. This was obvious then, it's obvious now, and it's as clear as day. This is not a war, this is a genocide. So the need of the global community now, the moral duty and obligation of the international community is to stop this senseless bloodbath, to call for a ceasefire, not just a humanitarian pause, but a permanent end to the hostilities. And it has to do so now. Now, not tomorrow. So, why is it important to stop it now? Because, well, look about the context. Every Israeli now puts the blame of this latest October 7 attack on Netanyahu, as well as the far-right ministers in the Israeli government for all of their provocations. And nothing is more terrifying than a dead man walking. And Netanyahu and his colleagues, Ben Gvir and Smotrich, are dead men walking. This war may be their political lifeline. They may have an incentive to drag it out as long as possible and to fulfill their radical desires while they still have power. Again, this war is not a war, this is genocide. So it's important now more than ever, for the international community to say enough is enough. Stop this senseless violence. And the world, particularly the United States, must rescind the blank check that it gave Israel, or it will be complicit in the predictable genocide that will occur. Now, the time is now for action. And it comes from not only governments, but also from you. From you as an individual, you have the power to make a difference. If you can, donate to medical aid for Palestinians. Donate for the United Nations Relief Works Agency, UNRWA. Donate to emergency relief efforts in Gaza. And make your voice heard. Speak out in your social networks. Speak out to your local representatives, to your leaders in your countries, and tell them to call for a ceasefire immediately. Your actions may make a difference. And I call on you, every listener who watches this podcast, to start acting now, to end this violence, to call for a ceasefire, and to push for peace. Thank you for listening, and I hope you'll tune in soon.